Well, thank you, Steve. A very kind introduction, and thanks to the HGS for the invitation to give a talk on this. The title on this has a little bit of hubris in it, and you might want to know where that comes from. And it started out at our shop over there. Wayne gave a talk to the HGS last year about global oil supply, and we started seeing a fair amount of talk in the literature about this huge supplies that were going to come out of shale. So I started diddling around with the numbers and, well, how much can you get out of this stuff? And Rick Baggett in here kept saying, that's not the right way to do it. You can never do it by hand. And this went on for a little while. And so finally Wayne got really sick and tired of us going back and forth about this right and that right. And he said, look, just go ahead and do it. Take the time out and go do it. So we did. So that's why Wayne's up here. And we also have Robert Fargo, who was a young engineer, was with us at the time. He's a very bright guy. He's gone back to school. He's got a full scholarship to Imperial after getting his first master's degree from Oxford and Princeton. And he would badger us with questions like, that can't be true. You know that that's impossible, things like that. So we punished him with putting his name on the list here. And I must say that the co-authors here didn't have anything to do with the title on this. This is all of my own little doings here. I was also told that this talk had an awful lot of graphs in it, and I want you to know that I take criticism very lightly. Now, shale oil, shale gas. If you look around the world, and this is some data that Mike Horn has put together, there are about 2,200 published locations of source rocks in the world. That's a lot of source rock in the world. And if you start to look at the volumes associated with source rocks like that, and it's absolutely stupefying. Massive, massive amounts of volumes associated with these source rocks. But if there's one thing that I want you to walk away with, is the volumes don't equal to supply. And what this talk is all about is a way to model supply. And there's not an answer to the title, but there are ranges, and it gives you an idea to what we hope that you would walk away with is some boundaries on your uncertainties as to what actually constitutes supply, because it can be, it's a range of things. The conclusions that we have are whether shale gas can significantly reduce imported gas, and the answer is yes, but not in the near term, just with respect to oil. And can shale gas replace coal and nuclear? Reduce, yes, but replace not likely. And for shale oil, can shale oil replace the imported oil? Reduce, yes, but replace is not likely. Reduce is a weasel word, but I couldn't think up a softer word. And you'll see that as we go through these charts and stuff that I'm going to show you on here, and that you'll understand why we say reduce, but not likely to replace. The outline here, I'm going to give you a little perspective. Oops, this is not quite like mine. The perspective on global oil supply, particularly from the giants, and why we tell our clients that the price of oil is very likely to remain high as it is today. We'll go through their methodology in here, and then I'll give you the results for the shale oil and shale gas on here. But first on here, I don't want anybody to say that I'm anti-oil or negative on oil. But the fact is, the United States has a very great economic incentive to reduce its imports of oil. Think of it this way. Importing 1 million barrels a day costs the United States about $30 billion that goes overseas and does not come back to the United States. Manufacturing is in the far east of the world. Does not come back, so that's gone. If you divide $50,000 into $30 billion, you get about 600,000 jobs. And those jobs, when that money stays in the States and domestically, it has a multiplier effect, and economists use from 2 to 6. But if you just use a 0.5 on it, then you get up to 1 million jobs. So if you reduce our imports by 1 million barrels a day, you're adding 1 million jobs to the U.S. economy. Now, jobs are important, but the other side is overall where oil fits, because the United States used to be that oil was the big culprit that went overseas. That's no longer true. China has managed to work its way into the headlines fairly well. But beyond that is our overall financial drain. There's a lot of capital moving out of the United States now. And this line here shows back in '98 this increase in the major financial outflows as a percent of our GDP. And that was when Congress allowed companies to leave their earnings overseas without paying taxes on them. This is a percent growth GDP, and you see that this thing has been rocking along in the 90s in here, 3 and 4%. We had the turn down with the bubble .com bust in the early 2000s, and then in 2008 we had this turn down. Now this green is a percent of GDP that is oil, and that was about 1% up until about the past decade. And that's when the point at which it gets over 2%. We get over $100 a barrel, and you're getting over 3% of GDP. And that begins to significantly and negatively affect our economy. But that's one of the major pieces in conjunction with the other capital outflows of the nation. Now the other thing is here, in terms of oil supply. Most everybody in this room remembers the '85 turn down. There was also a major turn down in the '50s. Now let's look at some of these supply curves on here. This is from Ray Leonard's work. It gave us the idea and the data from BP. But look at OPEC oil supply. This is what gets back into the early '80s when the OPEC oil supply dropped off down to almost a 15 million barrel a day drop, and then it climbed since then. The gray line up here is the non-OPEC supply. And what I want to point out to you is this part of the non-OPEC supply is flattening during the last decade. It is flattening in here also at the time of a major rise in oil prices during the last 10 years. So what that says is that there's a crimp on oil supply from the non-OPEC world. At the same time, notice that the OPEC supply has disappeared in terms of excess supply on here. This is a 15 million barrel a day supply excess. And when Ronald Reagan could go over to Sheikh Faisal and say, I'm going to make a trade with you. You give me cheap oil that'll help the U.S. economy, and I'll give you U.S. air power to protect your nation. He can make a deal like that then. That can't be done anymore. Now, when we look at the supply from the giants, since about 1965, the giant oil fields, which comprise less than 2% of all the oil fields in the world, that 2% of the oil fields has added 60% of our daily production. This is the Mark Twain time. Remember when Mark Twain said it was okay to put all your eggs in one basket, or watch that basket? Okay. Giant oil fields are something that we need to watch and understand, and we don't really have a lot of data on them. Now, because of that 60%, I don't know what really balances that 60%, but it's a natural economic balance, my guess is, between the low-cost suppliers being able to provide a small amount of oil and maximize their price of oil. So let's just assume that that 60% holds for the next couple of decades on here. Now this blue line is our consumption that we've held up to about this point, and I just straight lined it out to there. That's our total consumption, and this line is just 60%. And this is a way to get at how much of the giant fields of the world have actually been produced. We don't have a lot of data on the production from these fields, but this is a way to get to that. Now, this is that same 60% field. This is 2010. And this green line on here is the discovery history of the giant fields of the world. And this discovery history shows we got about 1,400 billion barrels over there, and at this point, about 800 billion barrels has been produced. Now, because of those last ratios, we now have the consumption and the reserves. And this blue line then shows the annual, whoops, oh, I'm sorry. This is the percent of the consumption on these giant fields, projected out to 2040. But you can see from here that that percentage of our consumption on here is going to change rapidly within the next couple of decades. And that's going to put pressure on supply. These supergiant fields around the world are not going to last forever. And we are on a tightening supply from these supergiants. And we went through this period in the past in which prices could be driven down because of that great excess supply. It does not exist anymore. OPEC has about 4 million barrels a day of excess supply now. So supplies are going to remain tight, we think, for the continuing future. What does that mean for the oil prices? This is our oil prices back in the late 70s, and that was a politically driven event. This is the price hike that we have seen in the last decade, and that is something that's driven more by basic economics. And that's why when you say the end of cheap oil, it says on there it's also the dawn of shale oil, and that you'll have the prices to support shale oil, assuming that the world economy continues. Okay, modeling production from shales. Our volumes methodology is very straightforward, and I think if we gave it to everybody in the room, everybody would basically multiply the same elements together. We'd look at the well production profiles, number of rigs, wells drilled per month, the well spacing, and the abandonment criteria. We put limits on it in terms of the resource volume, the area of the resource, and we had an arbitrary limit of 50 years. We figured if our projections are wrong for the first 50 years, there wasn't any sense in making it worse for another 50 years. And I will show you these outputs on here, but fundamentally we're going to be looking at supply rates from this area. The other thing that we have done in here, Rick has done such a nice job of, is going through the economics. We include all the things that you do in your everyday that you love and hate about economics in terms of the basics of what your product price forecasts are, your price escalations, all these normal things that we have on investment, expenses, indirect costs, as well as taxes on here. So we can model both per well as well as total project types of economics. Now, when we did that, we said, well, there may be some bottlenecks that are faced in the real world around drilling these things. And we came up with a very long list of bottlenecks. And this is just a sample of the list that we have over here, from the pre-drill to drilling, the completion, transportation, societal choices, financial. And we have been very careful and to ignore all of these things. Now, that is important because the numbers that I'm giving you are going to be maximum numbers based on the inputs. But that's, we recognize and acknowledge, but I don't know how in the world you're going to get around some of these other questions. Now, what does the supply curve look like on here? And this gives you two of them. And this is the barrels, billions of barrels per day, and this is time in the years. This is a profile that's based on a fixed EUR of 30 billion barrels and a fixed type of a well decline. And we put about 1,200 rigs into this, and we get a supply curve that looks like that. Put 150 rigs into it, and we get a supply curve that looks like this. Neither one of these we feel is reasonable. But you should see these things to see the extremes on here. One of the things that we say about supply is that supply is not a rate in terms of barrels per day. It only has meaning when you put a time with it and an EUR. It's kind of like one person getting married. You got to have two for it to work. Supply only has meaning when it has a duration associated with it. Now this is not going to happen on here because here you have, with this large drilling fleet over here, and the banks are not going to support something like that. That is an economically unstable situation. In the case of this case with the long plateau on here, that's not going to happen because you lose NPV because it sits way over here for 30 years. So it's the world, Mr. Market is going to give us whatever it comes out in between. Now there's a number of variables in here and they are linked. And I want to show you how some of these are linked. This is a comparison of rig count. And this is the years of the duration of the plateau. And this is the BCF per day. And here we picked 100 TCF and said, well, what happens when you drill it up with a 50 rig fleet? What happens with a so increasing number of rigs? And in this case, what it says is that we get about 8 BCF a day, but the plateau lasts about 35 years. If we double the rig count on here, we roughly double the supply rate, but the plateau on this is then cut down to about 12 years, to about a third. So the life of the production on this is non-linear, whereas the maximum production rate tends to be roughly linear. Now, the other side of this is in terms of NPV. This is the plateau duration in here, and this is NPV. And this is 25 years of a plateau duration. What it's showing on here is that the NPV increases as you shorten the plateau. So you're bringing more hydrocarbon on stream earlier on, and that's raising the plateau. And what that says is that a company that has a large drilling budget will make more money off the same project than a company with a small drilling budget. So if your company can drill something up, say, in 20 years, but somebody else will drill it up in 5 years, they could have, well, whatever that is, 50% increase in the NPVs. So these NPVs are very much contingent upon the context in which they are drilled up. Okay, possible production from shale oil. The competition is going to determine the prices in here, and we said that the shale oil production is going to work as long as the global oil price is high. Okay, you guys knew that. What's going to happen to shale oil from other countries, though, we really don't know. It's going to be a slow evolution over there, but there's certainly a large interest in transferring technology overseas. The other one, though, which is less obvious, is that an oil plateau is going to occur. And that's due to the expectations of here in terms of the cost of the infrastructure, because you're not going to develop an infrastructure inefficiently. In other words, you're not going to build up a large influx of infrastructure to get a high rate and then just have it drop right off. It's going to balance out there, and Mr. Market is going to determine just how that evolves on there. Secondly, this plateau on here for oil is shorter than for gas, and you'll see a little bit more of that. But basically right now, there's not as much EUR for oil as there is for gas, but there's also other, the demands in terms of what the companies can do with it is to develop their acreage as quickly as they possibly can, and there is a market in the U.S. that will sustain that production. Now, what do we have for the type curves in here? There is not a lot of data about the type curves, but we've talked to some of the folks who worked on these things. We didn't just go to the publications in here in terms of the company reports on here, but we looked at a lot of these things. We looked at different places around in the U.S., and we got a range, and basically what we're looking at on here is it ends up that most of the data comes out of the Bakken in terms of our most reliable data. And so this presentation is kind of geared toward the Bakken. It's not really going to be a Haynesville, which is at the high end of the production rates. But if you'll keep these in mind, the good curve on here, the best curve, is about 800,000 barrels. The lowest production curve on here is about 300,000 barrels. And we felt that this would capture an awful lot of, it would capture the minimum economic size that we see in the Bakken over there, and would also capture kind of an upper range that would be somewhat appropriate. Now, we recognize that technology is going to change, and what we're trying to give you is a snapshot of, given what we have today to work with, what does the forecast look like? And this one, we looked at from the standpoint of what those variable wells look like with a fixed 250 rig drilling effort. And I also chose 30 billion barrels for the EUR. Now, where in the world does 30 billion barrels come from? And there's a lot of talk about EUR particularly from the Bakken, Haynesville, and so forth like that. And it's very, very difficult. The USGS is going back and looking again at some of its assessments, and you hear a lot of noise in the industry. And so it's very, very difficult to get a number. But what we picked one out, which we thought, well, it's probably not a bad number for today. It may very well change, but it gives us at least a number that we can work with that's probably on the high side. It's certainly higher than the published things that you get out of the USGS and various places like that. And what it's showing on here is for these three different well profiles on here is for the weakest well, we get about 2.5 million barrels a day that's sustained for 25 or 30 years. For our middle well, you don't really get a long plateau, but at least you get somewhere around 3.5 to 4 million a day on this thing for well over a decade. For our best well over here, there is no plateau, but it gets over 6 million barrels a day. And that's with our 30 billion barrels on here. So really what it's saying is from the information that we see today in terms of the United States becoming independent of importing oil, it doesn't seem to be in the cards given this kind of an input. So if we take this thing and we take just looking at the role of EUR, this is that best well on there, and it says that if we have using 150 rigs, our best well could give us 4 million barrels a day for several years over here. That's 30 billion barrels. Now as the EUR comes down, in the same drilling effort, this is 20 billion, this is 10 billion. You can see how you just walk back on this supply curve over here and shorten this plateau. Now that's not real life on there, but it gives you an idea of how some of these variables are related to one another. Let me just skip that one. This one just says that if you've got a fixed plateau of 7 years on there, what kind of effort does it take? And the number of rigs is 166, 110, and then 56 rigs on there. But now the other question we get commonly asked is, what about the Bakken? Now, does anybody in here know how much is in the Bakken? Well, I don't either. But we have a range on here. I picked 5 billion barrels and 20 billion barrels and said, well, what can happen on this? And this is a 150 rig program over here and fixed 20 million barrels and our three favorite well profiles. And what it shows on here is that the Bakken with 20 billion barrels could produce, with the best well, 800,000 barrels well, could produce between 3 and 4 million barrels a day for in the range of maybe a decade on here. Our weakest well in there gives us about 1.5 million barrels a day for several decades on here. So at 20 billion barrels, the Bakken is likely to give us probably somewhere in here between 1.5 and 3 million barrels a day additional production. Well, what if it's only 5 billion barrels? Well, then you can see that the patterns in here change quite significantly. And just like we were walking these things back before, that's what you're seeing here. It walks back in time. And in this case, what you're seeing with the worst well is a little over 1.5 million barrels a day. And right now the Bakken is producing around 400,000 barrels a day. You're getting, rigs are going in and getting up to 200 rigs are in the Bakken now. And people are predicting that it'll be over 1 million barrels a day in a few years. And that doesn't seem to be too far off. Now, the other question is, what does it take for oil independence? And, well, what are we importing? Well, we need more than that. This is our 9 million barrels that we're importing today. Now, what we've said is that you have to give a time frame. How long are you going to produce it? So that's what we see on this axis down here. These are the plateau years of duration. And we're saying, let's get at least, whatever we're going to have for independence, we want it to last at least 10 years. And that's what this is right here. That's what that box is. That's what we're importing today, and that's what lasts greater than that. When we go through the numbers on it, we get somewhere over in here, that's this green area. This is 50 billion, 100, 150 billion barrels. So you need somewhere in excess of 100 billion barrels on there to get something in the range of what we would call oil independence for longer than just a year or two. So this is kind of well, that's what it is. Okay, now what about gas? Maybe gas can help us out with oil. Okay, considerations on gas production profiles. The competition is going to limit the price just like it does everything else, but particularly LNG. There's a lot of LNG and there's a lot of stranded gas in the world, and that's a price limit that is not going to go away anytime soon. The other thing that's going to happen, of course, the global shale gas is going to start growing as we go through, and then just the conventional domestic in here. There are still potential in the U.S. for domestic production, and with our other technologies going on, there's also a lot of opportunities in there. Now, gas production, though, must have a long plateau, and it must be a lot longer than we've seen for oil. And the reason that the plateau, we think of a minimum plateau for the nation on gas, is going to be in excess of 30, 35 years. And the reason for that is that power plants, nuclear plants, coal plants, as well as the transportation infrastructure is going to require a long period of time. Many of the licenses on power plants run in excess of 30, 35 years. So that's kind of our minimum range to get back to a minimum amount of gas that's necessary. What can increase gas consumption on here? Well, the gas for transportation gets a lot of attention, but it's going to be very difficult and slow to do. And the reason for that is it just costs too much money to take a vehicle and can add CNG capacity to a gasoline car. You're going to have to replace the whole car all at once. Europe has these things all over the place. Canada's had them for a long time. The United States could have these things, but we're not producing them here. Now, one of the other things that can be done is people talk about the problems with supply CNG for the vehicle fleet. Well, you as a person, there's nobody in this place that does not own an air conditioner. Everybody has an air conditioner. Now, your house has more value with an air conditioner than without. What if you had another appliance in your garage, and that was a gas compressor, natural gas compressor? Plug your cars in, it costs about the same as an air conditioner, and it adds value to your house, and it pays for itself a lot faster than your air conditioner does. So in about 10 years, you could probably pay it off. So there are ways to make this thing happen, but it's going to take a while to do it. Much more quickly, I think, is increased gas for power, both replacement for coal as well as nuclear on here. We're not going to replace all of these, but we'll substitute them. There can be, the EPA is looking to shut down something like 15% of our coal plants over the next 5 or 6 years on there. If they do that, they're also going to have the replacement is going to be natural gas and not nuclear, because you can't get the nukes permitted in that time. So in terms of near-term growth, power is certainly one of the opportunities that we see. These are the range of the gas declines that we use. The best well over here is a 4 BCF well, and our worst well is a 1.5 BCF well. Again, we use the same sort of economic choices in terms of trying to pick the ranges of what the declines might look like. And this is looking at what the U.S. resource, again, we don't know what that resource number is, but what it might look like through time. And I picked a 1,000 TCF off here, talked with John Curtis and went over a lot of this stuff with John. John has published a lot, very knowledgeable about a range of these values over here, and the recent report with the Potential Gas Committee. And you'll see numbers in our resources for gas running 4,000 TCF. 1,000 TCF is a pretty healthy number as it is. And we often hear this 100-year supply. Well, we really don't see too much of the 100-year supply until you look at the rates on here. Now, this is our best well over here. This big red arrow is what the U.S. currently produces now, about 65 TCF, a BCF a day in here, and it gives us a plateau on there of about 30 years for 1,000 TCF. So that was what it would take on there with our 4 BCF well. So physically, you can say, well, you could give us 40 years supply with 1,000 TCF. And then we go down into the lower rate wells on here. The maximum rate that we can get from our poorest wells, given this 500 rig fleet, is about a third of the 60 BCF over here. This cutoff at that point is our arbitrary 50 years cutoff. And they still got another 600 TCF to go out of this production on here. But replacing our current production with shale gas, we don't have the resources unless you get above this 1,000 TCF. Higher TCF and you can do it. Now, let's look and compare what can you do with that for transportation. This is the same graph I was showing you a little earlier, but this is the energy conversion at an OEB basis, and this is our daily imports. Comes in here. My slide slipped on me. Sorry about that. But this 60, and yeah, there it went. That's fine. This is our daily imports in terms of 1 million barrels of oil equivalent, and you can see that we would. You can make the argument, well, we have enough gas to get up there. Now, just alone, this is just transportation alone. Now, the next thing to look at is in terms of power. And the EIA gives us a lot of numbers on there. And in this case, they gave us megawatt hours, and they also showed us just how many TCF a year we're consuming in natural gas to make electricity. Comparing that number, this is not an energy conversion. The last one I showed you was an energy conversion, but this one says, well, how much TCF per MCF per megawatt is required. That's what we're actually using. So just multiply that times the coal and the nuclear, and we come over here, and we come up with the natural gas equivalent, and you add those together, and that's about 20 TCF per year. Now, let's go back over what we just had. We're currently producing about 22 TCF. To replace coal and nuclear power requires another 20 TCF. Replacing imported oil is going to be 20 TCF plus, for a total of about 62 TCF per year. And so we added a 1,500 rig fleet and went back to our 1,000 TCF and said, well, what happens? And this is what happens on here. This is this 180 TCF per year on this thing. And you can see that high rate on this, our best well over here, really doesn't give us much of a plateau. So you put in a lot of infrastructure and you wouldn't get a lot of use out of it before you would run out of resource. In contrast with the lower rate on here of about 70 BCF a day on here, with our lower well on here, we would end up with about a plateau on there of 30 years supply. So there's a lot of gas out there that can be brought in to bear. But replacing all that gas is what I would say, replacing all that coal and oil and nuclear, you're not going to do all of these things all at once. So, what's next? What are the possibilities of looking ahead? One is we have a wonderful natural resource out there. It can do a lot to help our economy. Go back to our 1 million jobs, we can do that. And our industry needs to get the credit and recognition for what it can do. And that takes energy policy over here. We've got to develop them. We don't have this time to mess around anymore. Our industry is going to have to provide the technical basis for that energy policy. And we're going to have to find people that can actually listen. And we're going to have to explain it, and we're going to have to put out more data than we have in the past. That's just, the world is changing, and we have to change with it. Third on here is building confidence in the regulatory environment. Now there's a big challenge. Our industry gets challenged all the time with criticism over here. But think back to the origin of the AAPG, 1917. Why was it founded? AAPG is a technical organization, but one of the great impetuses to drive the formation of AAPG, for those guys in Tulsa, in northern Oklahoma over there, they wanted to know who the bad guys were. They wanted to know the poor operators. They wanted to get together and find out. And they did that, also exchanging technical information. In developing these shales around our nation, we're going to have to do the same thing with finding, identifying, and keeping the bad operators out. We had one accident in the deep water thousands and thousands of wells drilled in the deep water. One accident. The whole world, every country in the world that has an offshore with an activity on it is revising and looking at its regulations. Some of those will be improvements, and some of them won't be. And our industry needs to do a super bang-up job in terms of building this confidence by the public. It's been put on our plate, and we don't like it, but we have to do something about it. Now, that's the end of the grass. Thank you very much.
Okay, I think we have time for a few questions, if anybody has some.
Yes, sir.
How long do you think it's going to take to burn off the current gas bubble?
Never. That's a flippant answer, but really, gas is always...
With the lowered prices, you get a lowered rig count, and you're not going to replace it faster.
Yeah, but you know, that's the nature of the market, is to go up and down, and that's why I say never. And there's a, you know, we tend to oversupply it, and you know, prices, you know, when it's undersupplied, the prices go up, and we hit it with too much. There's no real way to balance that except the market. I don't know another way to do it. The other answer I had to that, which is flippant, was just outlaw LNG, but you know, that's not going to happen. But we have to live with that, and I think that's what a lot of this shows us on there is in terms of exercising some restraint on the activity levels in some of these areas.
Well, the hidden agenda there was that I'd kind of like to buy gas stocks now when they're low, and I want to know how long I'm going to have to wait until I sell it when the price goes up.
The question was how to buy low and sell high. Thank you very much. Next question. Man, I don't know. Yes?
When, as a profession, are we going to have the balls to stand up and say, this is not what we are, this is what we are, this is what we do, this is why and how we do it, and we're not out to deliberately rape the environment?
Well, I think that takes a long time to build that kind of confidence in us, and I think that we have to go put forward the effort and acknowledge that some people are just plain scared. I mean, you just look around the nation this year, and you had earthquake in San Antonio, Oklahoma City, and Washington, D.C., places we haven't had earthquakes before. Now, then the untrained are going to put these things together and say, this is scary, and they're going to start asking questions, and we need to be prepared for things like that. We have to acknowledge that people have been scared, rightly or wrongly, and we're going to have to find better ways to do it. Unless someone's got a better way to do it, I don't know. I mean, I'm not a seer. But, yes, sir.
Since you do international consulting, what are the Chinese's take on your data or data generation, comparing it, and then what are they seeing as their national agenda for trying to maintain their economic advantage or maintain an economic plateau?
The question is, what's the Chinese perspective on shale oil and shale gas?
Yeah, and how are they going to address that, trying to maintain their economic plateau?
Well, golly, it's been a long time since I worked China. I really don't have any fresh information, but I just have what I read to see what in the trade journals, and certainly the Chinese. I think you really have to say that they're very pragmatic and realistic, and they're much more. I think what's the word I'm looking for? They have a very robust frankness in realizing the role of energy for their country. And they are very concerned about energy supplies far more than we are. And we're very vulnerable. This nation, you look at the giant supply on that, and the United States is very vulnerable to price hikes. And price hikes can just do tremendous damage to this nation. And I think that's the other intangible side of improving our shale oil supply is it reduces the potential for the price hikes. But I don't think that we have a good national understanding of our energy.
Has any of your modeling said, okay, let's do a $2 trillion one? Because that's not a rocket science.
Well, that'll be, maybe you'll give a talk on that next time.
All right, well, we have our traditional Speakers Award for Dick. We want to thank him for a very informative talk. And so with that, we're adjourned. Thank you very much for coming tonight.